And I would like to start by introducing Atsushi Iriki as the first speaker. I met Atsushi the first time during the 2007 workshop, Conceptual Neuroscience in Wageningen in Holland. And that was one of the first workshops that were organized by Institute Paralimet. Atsushi gave a talk in that workshop on the work he did on understanding changes in the brain of monkeys as a function of their learning to use tools. Afterwards, he approached me with a question if I could advise him on setting up an institute like Paralimet in Japan. It was the beginning of a long and deepening friendship. Because Atsushi is not only a researcher, but also a philosopher and a deeply spiritual man, he triggered my interest in Eastern thinking. He, in fact, introduced me to the Dalai Lama last year during a conference in Kyoto. Atsushi is a visiting professor at NTU and has become a close collaborator in a number of projects that developed out of this relationship. I've had the privilege to follow some of his scientific work during the past few years, and even though I understand only a small bit of it, that bit gets me more and more excited. So it is with great pleasure that I ask you to give a warm welcome to Atsushi Iriki.
Well, thank you very much, Jan, for a very kind introduction, and also giving me the honor of being the first speaker of this conference. Yes, I like this one. As myself being the neuroscientist, I am interested in how the human intelligence may have emerged. And since we have a primate brain, we are the one species of the primates. And I think that's human intelligence must have evolved through some sort of evolutionary processes which have a biological mechanism behind it. So, the biological mechanisms. And I would like to propose today my theory of Triadic Niche Construction. And it's a strange term, so I would like to start with a conclusion slide. Is that in the primates, as a living organisms in the environment, and brains do not stand alone. The expression of the brain function is our cognition. And that is living or harmonizing with the environment. And the term niche is defined as the resources in the environment that subserves the species living in the environment. And I metaphorically extended the concept of the niche into neural niche and cognitive niche, which stands for the neural resources of the brains. And if it's bigger, the brain expands. And as a cognitive niche, it's kind of metaphorical extension of the environmental niche with the resources of the cognitive function, a different kind of intelligence, like language, mathematics, physics, chemistry, whatever, which do not exist in the primate brain, probably. And the monkey's not thinking about the chemistry, probably, but humans do. And these three kinds of niches interact with each other. And primate monkey brain and human brain have different kind of interactions. But through some unknown mechanisms, there should be the circle. Circle should show up, but it's disappearing. But through the interactions, somehow these three kind of niches, by interacting like a positive feedback-like interactions, that gradually expands and become more and more bigger. And that emerges some new things, which ends up in the human kind of intelligence. So this is a topic that I would like to put forth through my talk. And how to explain this. This is the outline of my talk today. The first, I would like to introduce our previous studies that learning or education changes or induces some biological mechanistic changes in the brain, and also thereby expressing the new cognitive functions. This is evidence that I have been studying for past 10, 20 years. And then through the interaction of these three kind of niches, that induces the expansion of individual niches. The Darwin has already termed this phenomenon as a niche construction, which means that the typical example is a beaver. Beaver is a kind of the rat-like animals living in the forest originally, but they happen to create a dam in the river, and thereby they produce aqueous environment that didn't exist before. So they create the new niche, environmental resources to subserve their livings. So this is a concept of the niche constructions. In other words, it means that activity of the certain kind of the function create new resources of that discipline. This is a niche construction. So through the triadic interactions of three kinds of niches, that gradually expands gradually more and more, and that gives more resources to the individual niches. So I would like to introduce you the evidence that it actually looks like have happened during the course of evolution. And then I will extend to the biological mechanisms for transgenic inheritance. Because if the learning or education induces some plasticity or changes in brain or culture or function, it's just learning processes that happens in the individual life. And it has to be transmitted to the next generation. Otherwise, evolution never happens. But it is unlikely to assume that this have happened by simple mutations and natural selections. It's too rapid for human intelligence to emerge in the past few tens of thousands of years. But there must be some other mechanism, but have to be transmitted over the generations. And I would like to propose that this is a kind of an epigenetics mechanism through, say, mirror neuron system, whatever. Probably mirror neuron is already famous. I'm not going into the detail, but some have role in the interaction with others or social structures or cultures. And finally, this is just a hypothesis that I would like to put forth, and how I would like to introduce you how to prove it. So this is the outline of my talk today, spending like 1 hour or so. So this is my plan. So let's start with the learning or education-induced neural cognitive plasticity in the brain. As Jan has already introduced me kindly, I started up with training the monkeys to use tools. Because humans, in a human environment, there's full of tools and artificial things, like buildings or cars and roads. That's all the kind of the tool that humans have invented and are embedded in the environment, which monkeys do not have. But I started by trying to train or educate the monkeys with this human-like intelligence, intelligent functions. Like the chimpanzees or apes rarely use tools. They sometimes use tools, like the chimpanzees fish the termites, and that's well known. And also some crows can use tools sometimes. But surprisingly, it has been believed that macaque monkeys, like the monkeys living in Singapore, rarely or never use tools. There was no evidence so far, until very recently. I'll come to this point later. But I thought that it could be trained to use tools and see what happens when we artificially intervene into the primate brain function and what kind of changes might be induced by true use training. It's not just acquisition of the new function, but actually there is something else have been found through this activity. So I'll show you my old slide. This is Japanese macaques using rakes. They rarely use rake in their natural habitat. But through 2 weeks of training, monkey become able to use tools. He is collecting the bait, food, beyond the reach of the natural hand, but he can extend it. And you must have recognized that he is using something else, which is a TV monitor. And that rarely exists in the forest. But monkey can use it. Because human kids love to play video games. Probably we are furnished with the built-in primate function that is designed otherwise, but could be utilized or reused to this video game functions. And what I have doing here is that monkey is not using rate as it is, but he's looking at this video monitor just in front of him. And if you superimpose some like spots in the monitor, what happens is the monkey thinks or believes, be believing that something is there and trying to use it. So actually, this is a behavioral evidence, I thought, that monkey is thinking that this is extension of its hand. If you play the video games, you have some feeling that you're projecting yourself in the video monitor. And if something like a rock or something comes towards you, you just escape from that. So this means that we have some ability to project beyond our physical entity within the world. And that cannot be furnished in the primate brain if not they are trained. And what happens to the brain? So what I did is that I thought that using tools as extension of the body is a modification of your body image or body schema that is built in the brain. And by using those schema, we'll design our movement. So if you use a stick and grope into the ground, probably you have a feeling that you have extending your hand through the stick, where the stick is incorporated into your body image. Or if you see yourself projected in the video monitor, you have a feeling that your self-image is projected onto the video monitor. And this phenomena has been discovered or found neurologically 100 years ago by the neurologist. It's already reported in 1911 that in the part of the brain is called parietal cortex, the side of the brain. If that part is damaged, the patient loses their body schema. The phenomena that doctors reported is that it was in London. At that time, the women used to wear a hat with a long feather on it. And this patient, when he passes through the gate or bar, we usually bend our head so that the feather don't touch onto it. But if the parietal cortex damaged patient, they lose their body schema. If you go under the gate, it's just the hat flips over because they cannot understand or perceive that your body is extending, have something attached on it. And it's a loss of body schema. And why in the parietal cortex? This is because this is the left side, left half of the brain, or the human brain. And these colored areas are called primary sensory areas that handles or receive directly from the sensory organs the information that sensory organs collect. This is the visual area, back of the brain, receive the information from the eye, and this is the auditory area from the ear, and this is the somatosensory area or tactile area received from the skin. And parietal cortex resides here, which is in between tactile or somatosensory information processing area and the visual information processing area. And if you think about the body schema, that needs to integrate both the visual and tactile image about your body. And thereby, the neurologists assume that body schema is formed and coded in this area. And if it was damaged, the patient loses the body schema. And what I have done about 15 years ago is I poked the electrode into this area of the monkeys. It's not the humans, of the monkeys. And recorded the response patterns of those neurons or nerve cells, how they respond to the information about the body. And since this is sitting in between the tactile area and the visual area, they respond to the palpation of the skin, which transfers the tactile information about the hand. It's resembled to the somatosensory cortex neurons. However, this neuron at the same time have visual properties, response properties, and this black line represents the trajectory of the probe scanning all the space. If I have a monkey here, you experimenter scan the whole space like this without touching the tactile receptive field. But if this neuron fires or produces action potentials or discharges when monkey see the probes approaching his hand, the meaning that has the visual responses in the space related to the hand. And I call it the visual receptive field. And this was a phenomenon. I think this is the only data I presented today. But this neuron have both visual and somatosensory information integrating at the same time, thereby coding the body image. And what had happened when the monkeys were trained to use tools or trained to use video monitor is that these receptive fields extend along the tools. In other words, these neurons or brain nerve cells respond equally or equivalently both to the tools and hand. This is kind of a natural thing that we can understand, but on the other side, this is a very crazy thing. It's a wrong thing. Respond regarding the object and the hand. That's the same thing. I come to this point later, but thereby I thought that we found the neural evidence. The functions is modified by tool-use training or video-use training. So education modifies the brain function. And interesting thing that intrigued me is that this is not instantaneous. This is not immediate thing. This needs 2 weeks of training, intensive training for monkeys, not for humans. So meaning that some changes must be induced in the brain to enable these nerve cells to respond differently. So that's the beginning of this emerging changes by the education. And I think in interest of time, I'll skip a little bit, but this roughly corresponds to the developmental pattern of the internal representation of the things during the baby growth up into the adults. The baby understands the world through interacting with others, like licking, walking, or something. If you have a baby, you know that. And this is called enactive representation by developmental psychologists. The first proposed by Jerome Bruner about 50 years ago. And then the human become like 10 years old kids. We understand the thing through the visual appearance. We understand by looking at it, by shapes, forms, and colors, and figures, and so on. And it's called iconic representation. And actually, the representation of the video body image in the monitor correspond to this. And after the human becomes matured, the representation becomes symbolic. We can understand the things by function, by structure, materials, and so on. It's become more abstracted. And this also corresponds to the evolution of archaeological stone tools. The form of the stone tools could be explained by this different kind of evolutionary the development of the representation. And for more complex study tasks, after monkeys was trained to use tools, single tools, what he could do almost immediately is that he can combine the tools. You can see what he's doing. There's a short tool and long tools, and there's a combination of the distance in the tools that the monkey can have to, construct a plan in advance. It's like a technological complex, planning of the things. And I thought that this was very difficult for monkeys to do. But surprisingly, once the monkey have learned to use a simple stick, he can almost do this immediately. So this means that there's some structural there's some structure in the brain that subserves this complex function. If we expose the monkey immediately from the beginning, they never can do this. So the important thing is that you have to learn the basics of the things intensively. And after acquire the basics, the application is rather easy to do. So this is the principle of the structure of the brain. And then what happens during this 2 weeks of training period is that first we started out with very simple materialistic change. It is called immediate early genes, gene expression. It's about 20 years ago. We first found that during this period, where we recorded a bimodal, this integrated neuron from, and during only specific to the period when monkey have learning this specific task, the gene, a sort of the gene is expressed in this particular area of the brain and disappears afterwards. So this was at first evidence, I thought, that some materialistic changes are induced in this brain area through the training education. And then after followed is that we did some other combination of things, and finally, eventually found the conclusion is that there are new projection from this part of the brain, which is the part of the parietal cortex, this is the monkey brain, left view of the monkey brain, and this part of the brain, there's a new connections formed to integrate visual information into this parietal cortex. This is a microscope tracing of the nerve fibers originating from this area, invading into this part of the brain, which we found this bimodal neuron before. And we actually found through the electron microscope, there's a synapse formed in this brain area, and this actually integrating the different information. So this is a kind of microscopic neural circuitry changes induced by training. And I come back to this morphological modification later. The next step I found is that since there's a structural organization of the different kind of intelligence, I thought about different kinds of tools could be trained in monkeys. If you think about the tools that human uses, there's many different kinds of tools. The most common or popular definition of the tools in the world, in the discipline, is that this is something object held in the hand and interact with the environment. I call this the motor tool. It's an extension of our motor apparatus. But if we think about that kind of tool that the humans are using, there's a different kind of tools, like binoculars or microphones or something like that. It's an extension of the sensory organs. And I first tried the monkey to use these same kind of sensory tools, which actually is an endoscope. The camera stick in the tip of the rake, tip of the stick, and explore that we cannot see, like an endoscope or a gastro camera that physician peek into your stomach. And we couldn't do that for 5 years. The tool use training, the rake use training was relatively easy. It's only a few weeks of training. But after 5 years of endoscope training, we could never train the monkey to do that. But then we have some inspired with some thought that there must be some structural organization. And first trained the monkey to use the rake stick, it's a motor extension. And what about attaching the sensory cue on top of that? And that's what happened is that, surprisingly, it was very easy. You can see that there's a rake attached with a mirror, and he is exploring something beyond the hump. We cannot see directly. But this was a very easy task. Only 3 or 4 days for monkeys to expose to this, and he can immediately grab this. So this is not externalized eyes yet. It's some sort of a sensory cue attached to the externalized or already learned modification of the body. And he can immediately do this. So there was a step-by-step structure of how the brain is changing. And eventually, there was a few steps, but eventually you could train the monkey to use the endoscope that I showed you before. There's a small camera attached to the tip of the rake, and this is the scenery from the front. Monkey is exploring underneath the opaque table. And this scenery is projected onto the mirror, into the monitor. It's like a gastro camera, and he can use this. So it's as if grabbing his own eye, or externalized eye, to the tip of the stick and exploring it. This is externalized eyes. And this could be trained by the structured educational system. So what does this mean? The monkey's or primate brain function is not fixed. And this is a diagram. I talked about development of the internal representation from inactive, iconic to symbolic one. This is a very much simplified axis of the human intelligence. I know that human intelligence is very multidimensional, it's complex, but just for graphical reasons, I just reduced it in a single dimension. And metaphorically, this is from simple to more complex function of the human intelligence, up to the metaphysics of philosophy. And then, this side is a kind of spectrum of the primate brain functions. And it's humans and comparison between humans and monkeys. And N stands for normal. And the normal humans are usually born at this level, and through the natural development and educational systems, some of us become like a philosopher. So wide spectrum of the intelligence that changes or develops throughout the lifetime. This is a human brain function. In contrast, in the monkey, the normal monkey in the wild are developed, are born at this level, and they never use tools in the natural habitat because they don't need it. So they are adapted to that environmental conditions, and brain is developed in such a way to most efficiently and most economically live through that given resources. So that's why they stop here, through the development. And that's why probably often said that monkey psychological level is like a human 2-year-old kids, and chimpanzee is like 7 or 10 years old kids intelligence, because they can sometimes use tools, sometimes mirror, and so on. So it looks like having an iconic representation. But I think I have proved, although artificial training, we can stretch in the trained monkey, stretch or expand this monkey spectrum or primate brain functions into more higher level. I'm not sure if monkey can become philosopher, but some sort of extension of the spectrum to invade into the so-called human-specific intelligent function. And this scheme would produce the overlap between human intelligence and monkey brain function, intelligent monkey brain function. And since this is a macaque monkey and could be subject to the medical experiments, we can study the biological mechanisms and structures of the primate intelligence using monkey brain, the human intelligence. And it's most likely that 2-use training is one of very efficient factors that triggers this expansion or this emergence of the human intelligence. And how is it is the next question. And coming back to this externalized eye, and this is still at the speculation level, but what happens if you look back yourself by your own externalized eye? This is a kind of the top view of yourself, or God view of yourself, or third-person view of yourself. In other words, it's called meta-self-recognition, or quantitative or objective self-control mechanisms. And if you objectify yourself objectively, what you feel, I thought, is that you can acquire the sense that your core self extends from past, present to the future. You know, these things, the perception is very difficult to acquire, even through the humans. We need the training to do this. In the non-human animal terms, they are living in the immediate world. They never think about it. And if this can happen, what we, a human brain, a primate brain, might start thinking is that if there is any useful information acquired now, you want to store it and use it for later. Store it for later use. That is the kind of external memory device or externalized brain. And eventually it ends up to the computer, which is the external thinking device. So again, here's an active structure, sensory structure, and symbolic structure of the externalized tools in the world. And actually, And coming back to the new connection that I introduced you before, and here the mirror neurons comes about. In sake of time, I'm not getting in too much into the mirror neuron system. It's already famous. But briefly, these are the neurons, the nerve cells in the brain that respond equally to your activity and my activity. So that's why it's called mirroring other actions. And it was first found in the monkey premotor area, the motor area, because it's related to the actions. But it's now known that this enactive self is represented in various areas, including premotor, parietal, and temporal cortices. And this is the area we are now interested in, recorded this bimotor neuron to code the body image. And the connection that I found, initially I thought this was connection between higher visual cortex to the interparietal area, and which is this one. But they're related to this mirror neuron system. There's a different kinds of the selves represented in the brain. This is already known. The original mirror neuron is coding the actions of others and yours. So this is called enactive self. And also there's a mirror neuron system, especially found in the human imaging study, that represent equivalence of others and your emotions. It's called emotional mirror neuron system. It's something around here. And there's other system that codes yourself and others. It's called perceptual self, like a temporal parietal junction area. This is the back side corner of the brain, which I found the new connection. And this is also found in the prefrontal cortex as well. But this is a perceptual self. And through this connection, by objectifying your body action through the two-use training, it's connected somehow, the perceptual self, with other mirror neuron system. So in this way, the whole different aspect of the representation of the self have now unified. And this small, tiny bits of new connections have changed dramatically the whole system. And hereby, we can come up, the human brain came up with the core self. And in this way, this changed the whole world. So, metaphorically, this is yourself, externalize your abstracted or ideal, externalized ideal self. You discovered your own actions, and that changed a lot. So these are the plasticities I have found through artificial training of the non-human primate brain. And it's actually induced and ends up with many modifications and reorganization of the circuitry at the micro circuit level. And that was not only things. It goes beyond farther than that. This is the next section of my talk. These three kinds of niches can expand or become bigger by the triadic interactions of the different kinds of niches. And as I will show you the evidence that it looks like the case, and it actually have happened. So I come back to this new two-use things. In the original Darwinian or neo-Darwinian evolution theory that the biologists are taught in our childhood is a combination of the natural selection, the mutation of the genes, and if the environment changes, adapted combination of the gene sequences are selected. This is natural selection that we all believe now. But as I told you, that Darwin has already proposed the idea of the niche construction by picking up the example of the beavers. But the different about the beavers or non-human animal niche construction and human niche construction is that the non-human animals are satisfied with their own newly created niches and stay there. Think about the beavers. They never improve their dam. There's no high risers or the more complex dams. So that they can create a new niche, and they monopolize those niche, and this is sufficient for them to survive, and they stop there because there's no intention or future plan including that. This is a natural phenomenon. It could be a part of natural selection, an accidental evidence that have happened. But think about humans. I just proposed it. By meta self-recognition, we have a sense of the future, a continuation of ourselves in the future, and keep trying to improve the future. The humans always wish or hope about a better future, more money, more comfortable future, designed for a better future. That's a constant wish that we are planning. And once we, the human ancestors, have invented a tool and embedded in the environmental condition, and thus create a new niche by tool using culture, there's many kinds of niches. And then the brain becomes modified by those newly created niche, and then create further plan for further better improvement and implement the new tools in the environment. And this is a kind of intentional or positive feedback between ecological and brain functions. This is the interaction with two niches. Think about our culture now too. We are always inventing the new technology, innovations, installing in the environment, and we adapt ourselves to the environment. And nowadays, we cannot live without a car. Our body, our functions are so adapted to these new tools embedded in the environment. So this is the first conventional kind of the niche construction. Oops. I call it ecological niche construction. This is a real niche construction. But the difference between humans and non-human niches are we are constantly improving through the positive feedback between ecological and neural niches. And then I touched upon the neural niche. What happens to the feedback to the brain through the ecological niches? I already told you about the microcircuit modification of the brain. But recently you found that brain actually expands. In the monkey brain, since the monkey could be trained to use tool in 2 weeks, and we can longitudinally scan the monkey structure of the brain and follow up. And recently it invented the new technology called voxel-based morphometry. This is a structural MRI. This looks like a functional MRI that you can, brain imaging that you usually see. But this is measuring the structure. Actually, the gray matter is the brain surface layer of the brain surface, which possesses the neural nerve cells. The gray matter signal increases, in this case, by 23% of this area, which is the parietal cortex, that we recorded bimodal neuron from, in 2 weeks in a single monkey. And conventional, or often we know the voxel-based morphometry study is comparison between professionals and amateurs of humans. Like musicians have a slightly thicker part of the brain, like 3%, by averaging 30 musicians and amateurs. Or sometimes the mathematicians have like 2-3% thicker gray matter in this parietal cortex compared to the naive humans. But in the monkeys, we can experimentally manipulate from the scratch, let the monkey acquire the new skill, then we can dramatically explore more rapid and massive construction of the new neural niches. And there are several areas in the brain that actually expand through these 2 weeks of training, and including this parietal area. And I call this neural niche construction. So this is a metaphorical extension of the conventional niches, that resources of the neural tissue or brain tissue actually expands, become bigger by environmental requirement. So this is the second class of niche construction. And then what is this expanded parietal cortex doing is the next question. The conclusion is that it's contributing to produce a new cognitive niche. But come back to the mechanism. This is a monkey brain, and this is a human brain, left side. And as I told you, this is a parietal area surrounded by primary sensory cortices, the visual, auditory, and somosensory. And this is the area to integrate these different kinds of information. It's called multisensory association cortex. And what is this area doing in monkeys is that they are actually controlling different kinds of movements. So this is the area expanding through the first initial stage of the primate evolution. When the primates start living in the arboreal environment, in the forest, they need a spatial coordinate transformation to live in this 3D world. And this is the most first expanded area. But what this area is doing is actually controlling eye movement, hand movement, head movement, and different coordinate systems. So this is a spatial information processing area. And if you plot this function in the monkey brain, the monkey parietal areas is almost occupied by these functions. The monkey brain are only doing this. But if you introduce like a two-use training, that's another coordinate transformation of your body axis in relation to the different space. And this put a little bit more resources by training, by neural niche construction. It's a slightly bigger brain area. And if you plot the human, the same function, we can plot it because it already exists. But there's much more room in between it. And this is the result of the neural niche construction in humans. So what is these areas in between these conventional spatial processing functions is the next question. This must have a same principle as original function. But by reusing it to different function, applying it to the different function, which result in the human intelligence. Probably this is the mechanism behind it. And I did, it's called meta-analysis, plotted the non-spatial function that's attributed to this parietal cortex area. And there's like hundreds of papers already published, both in monkeys and humans. Since this is a spatial processing area, there's many studies about processing the physical space. But there's some other functions attributed to this area, like mathematics, times, and so on. And I have classified these different kinds of functions applied to this parietal cortex in some different classes. There's many ways to classify it. But actually, there are physical space processing area. But there are some immediate extension of this is a kind of perceptual space, how you perceive or construct idea about outer space. And this is kind of equivalent between conventional physical space. But also can introduce a temporal space. If you perceive the time, it's often handled by this parietal cortex. And also social space. If you think about hierarchy of the social structure, it's have a kind of spatial structure. Upper layer, lower layer, something behind it, and so on. And also there's a conceptual space, or more abstract space. It's also handled this area. And these are a sort of the human-specific functions. And if you think about the way we think abstractly about the physical theory or whatever theory, we always use the metaphorical expression of the spatial processing. Bridge the gap of the ideas, the truth behind it, top view of the whole view. In any culture, in any language, we think this way. Although it's not a physical space, we always use this spatial metaphor. Probably by neural reuse and neural niche construction, we apply the same principle of information processing in the brain, applying into the different emerging human-like intelligent cognitive function. And these are, I call it, cognitive niche construction. And there are many, many human-specific cognitive functions that are attributed to this parietal cortex. In sake of time, I just want to introduce two our own studies, very briefly, which I think is a critical one. And one is, first example is illogical inference. You might think that humans are very logical and animals are illogical, but that's not true. The human often do very illogical inference, illogical way of thinking, and which is sometimes very efficient. The typical example is called stimulus equivalence. This is like a serialism. If A, then B, and if B, then C logic. If you combine this simple logical structure, it's a serialism at the time. For example, if you are looking at this picture, if you're trained to pronounce this apple, this could be trained. And if you hear the sound apple, you spell out this APPLE. This is another logic. And then immediately we can acquire, if you see this picture, see this apple, spell out this apple. That could be trained. And the interesting thing is that if you see this spell out this one, you immediately grab this idea, come up with this picture. I think all of us do that. And we don't think this is illogical, but it's a very illogical thing to do. If you think about A, then B, this is true. B, then C, is true. And if you C, then A, this is not necessarily true. If you see this and spell out this is serialism, and this is true. And we automatically do this all the time. This is called equivalence. And serialism is called transitivity. And why is this? If we train, say, monkey to train, because they cannot speak or write a spelling, we train the monkey with the different signals. But we train the monkey, if A, then pick up B logic, they can immediately do that. And if you combine it, it's difficult for monkeys, but still they can do it. But the interesting thing is that reverse logic is called symmetry. Humans often do this mistake, but with the monkey never do this. If present the monkey the sign B in the trained monkey that's already trained with if, they, and B logic, human can immediately pick up A, but monkey never do this because reverse is not true. You can understand that reverse is not necessarily true. It's sometimes true, but it's not necessarily true. This is the fundamentals of a logical structure. But you tend to forget it. That's why in any culture, again, in any language, there's a warning saying that reverse is not true. So you have to be very careful. But non-human animals are very logical. They never do this. And if you combine two, this is called stimulus equivalence. And good thing about this is this. It can combine completely different things and form the new concept. It's the basis of the concept formation. And this is also the basis of the language. And this is usually or sometimes very useful. It can save our logical structure. But if we make mistakes, it's sometimes fatal. You can be dead if you are making mistake in non-human animal society or structure. It's better not to do that. But probably human had acquired security to secure the safety by some other structure, like a social structure or something else. Probably we tend to acquire this. So what we have done is that made an abstract sign of this A, B, C, and combination, and which part of the brain is activated for handling this illogical inference. And we found that both in symmetry and stimulus equivalence, parietal cortex together with prefrontal cortex are activated with these functions. And this resembles to the language function. If we use a linguistic stimuli. It lights up the linguistic area, so it's not good. But we didn't use the linguistic area. But it's the basis of language. And it's the most fundamental thing of the human intelligence. And equivalence is something like regarding the different thing as the same concept. It's just like regarding the tools as a part of your body. I thought this is a crazy idea. Body is not a stick, and stick is not a body. But we can regard it as the same. That's why we can incorporate tool into the body, or in vice versa, body extend toward the tool. And this is not a definitive and exclusive interpretation. It has some polysemous or multiple meaning. It could be either way, and we can pick up the useful way. And that's kind of the emergence of the human-specific intelligent functions. And next example is the economic bubble. This bubble is something detached from the reality, and we produce our own fake value, and we just bet on it, and it necessarily fails. And we did this experiment just after Lehman shock, and we found, let the subject trade a stock in the scanner in the condition of economic condition, non-bubble and bubble conditions. And in both bubble and non-bubble condition stock trading in the scanner, we found these two areas are included in this. It's called ventral premodal area and superior parietal area. It's included in both functions. And this area is the brain area known to make a social or decision making. And this area is controlling attention of the different area or different brain functions or different functions. And both work together in both cases. And what is different between bubble and non-bubble condition was these two areas, which is, again, the parietal area and the different part of the prefrontal cortex. And in non-bubble condition, it's like a linguistic grammar control. It's premotor cortex, which is close to the Broca's area, controlling stock trading in the ruled way. It's based on the firm economic ground, so it's kind of the rule-based trading, and that's this. And when the economical value leaped out or take off from the economic fundamentals, what is incorporated in our way of thinking is that this area, parietal area, correlate strongly with this subject tendency of psychological metrics called time perspective, psychological time perspective. How long future you produce or you project your own feelings or something like that. It's based on the wishful thinking. And then at this time, interparietal cortex handle with the time and self-condition in the future and talk about an easy future and wish about a better future. And that strongly starts correlating with this part of the brain. And this kind of switches. And again, this area is incorporated, recruited in this human-specific functions. And again, the economic bubble is very illogical. But still, we believe in it. And finally, we fail. But sometimes it's very efficient, so that we tend to do that. So here, again, this scheme. Tool-use training seems like one of the very efficient factors to trigger these modifications in different kind of niches. Maybe this is not the only factors that trigger this, but it's very useful factors and most likely happened during the course of the past evolution. And the tool-use trained monkeys express many interesting functions like imitation, mirror self-recognition, joint attention, meta self-recognition. I'm not getting to many of these, but these are the functions, psychological functions that naive monkey rarely or never exhibit. But once they're trained to use tools, they seems like start exhibiting these interesting functions. And I have not explained about this bar so far. This is a human spectrum, and W stands for wild. And if we think about the human brain, compare with the monkey brain as a primate brain function, it is not, I thought it's not fair to compare educated, culturally educated human brain with wild monkeys. We have to think about brain of the wild humans. No, before the emergence of the human intelligence. But from the definition, there's no such a thing as wild humans. There's a very rare report, but it's often unreliable. So we are not wild. That makes us human. And what had happened? Probably there's some social or cultural pressure that resemble the similar as training in monkeys. We started training each other or learning each other. Otherwise, in monkeys, they have to be trained by humans. But somehow, something had happened in the human brain in the past recent history of the evolution of human evolution. Something happened in the human brain to make this new, like a phase transition, like emergence of the new function. And what is it? And I thought it's educational or social cultural pressure into the human brain. And that leads to the human mind and intelligence. And what is it? Again, with the mirror neuron system. Since it is a social function and social structure, have to do with some neural mechanisms subserving social interactions, interaction with self and the others. And the mirror neuron system, the original mirror neuron system became, the founder of the mirror neuron is my friend. And the concept of mirror neuron is often overgeneralized, and I think it's abused. But there's a very important component in it, and that could, I think, actually have contributed to the human intelligence. And what would like to show you is these kind of mirror neuron-like phenomena. Actually, we can observe in monkeys, and that has interesting functions. Since I am interested in the social interactions, we invented a task that involves two monkeys working together in the interesting setups. Just briefly, there are two monkeys sitting at the table, face to each other, and there's two buttons in front of that. And monkeys take turns by two times each. And when this monkey's turn, the two lights up in front of him. And they don't know which is correct, but they can guess after the repeated sequence of the task. And finally, when this monkey's turn, this monkey had the correct choice, both are rewarded. And if this monkey was not correct, both were not rewarded. So they work together, and the reward depends sometimes on the other monkey's task. And they change turns. And what happens here is that this is a video for this. And these monkeys sit in front of each other. And if the red light lights up, it's a turn of that monkey. And you can see this monkey is a little bit stupid, and this monkey is a little bit aggressive. And this video turns. And this monkey turns, and he got the correct choice, and he got rewarded. And this monkey turns and rewarded. And then take turns. And this monkey, he made a mistake. He was a little bit upset. And he made a mistake again, and he was very angry. And then his turn. So meaning that they are very careful at looking at others' behavior. And sometimes they try to, educate them, intervene to other behavior by upsetting. And usually they don't do that. but in this setup, they start doing this. And there are neurons in this mirror neuron system area. There's many different kinds of neurons. So the interesting thing is that, it's a too complicated figure, but just to grab the idea is that there's some neuron that is, I call it partner type, only respond when others are doing the behavior. And self type is respond only himself is doing the behavior. And the mirror type is respond both when he is or I am doing the behavior. This is a typical mirror neuron. But the interesting thing is that in the same group of neurons, there's a group of neurons that respond specific when others make error, trying to correct them. So these are some of the components we have not known before that have something to do with the pedagogic mechanisms. It's precursor of that. So having said all these, from the natural selection to intentional niche construction, now I can introduce idea of the triadic niche constructions. Ecological niche, cognitive niche, and neural niche interactive, like a positive feedback manner with each other, and start generating more resources into each of these three niches. And in this way, human mind or intelligence emerges. But good thing about this framework is that the cognitive niche, which previously thought the social science field or humanity field or culture discipline, can be grounded on the biological reality. And we can explain this in a hard science way, the social sciences. And that can produce a framework of this. However, as I told you in the beginning, this is just a plasticity in the individual lifetime. And these information have to be transmitted to the next generation. And how can this happen is the next question. And we still don't have a hard evidence for this, but we can have enough evidence to produce a hypothesis. And I'll talk a little bit briefly about this. Biological mechanism for transgenerational inheritance of this acquired functions. Again, these mechanisms. And this, since this is acquired after birth and have to be transmitted to the next generation, it's like a Lamarckism. It's ill-interpreted Lamarckism. But it has to be done. Otherwise, human evolution of intelligence is too quick to happen and too directed to happen. It's not just an accidental combination of the mutation and natural selection. It must have some other different extra genomic mechanisms. And we actually indeed have the candidate for these mechanisms these days, which is the many expressions by this extragenomic or epigenetic inheritance or evo-devo theory. And here we think about evolution of the evolution theory. Let's start from the Darwin origin of species in 1859. I'm not talking about how the Darwin adopted previous Lamarckian evolution theory. There's many different interpretations about that. But anyway, starting from this Darwin origin species, evolution theory looks like evolved every 70 years. Already Darwinian origin species, a revision of the Lamarckian evolution theory 70 years before origin species. But start with Darwin, origin species. He claimed evolution happened by combination of the three concepts, which is the variation of the individuals and inheritance and natural selections. At this time, genes are not discovered. DNA was not discovered. Darwin called this an element that could be transmitted to the generation. This is kind of a continuous, unknown conceptual factors that transmitted. It's just an element. And since this was continuous, Darwinian evolution theory, I'm not preaching too much here, but Darwinian theory has almost died out when the DNA was discovered, because this was discontinuous and transmitted. But somehow, the genius called Julian Huxley have unified by integrating, putting together other concepts, including DNA and genes. And this is called neo-Darwinism. And that's we are now believing for recent 70 years. Because I'm almost 60, but I have educated after neo-Darwinism. So we take it as a default. This is just a hypothesis. And Julian Huxley's neo-Darwinisms, or extended modern synthesis, have published in 1942, but 70 years after this. And already 70 years have passed. And now we have a concept of extended synthesis, incorporating niche construction, epigenetic inheritance, and many other concepts that we know that actually exist recently. And this can give us a platform, a mechanism, how the human intelligence, emergence of the human intelligence could be transmitted over generation and is contributed to evolution. So the idea is this. Triadic niche construction emerges through the evolution, and what will be the mechanism for that? A hypothesis here, I saw this one, epigenetics in the mirror neuron system. This is just a crude diagram to explain our idea. It's not proved yet. But think about this blank bar. This is a primate brain design, the function of all the primate. And all the primates have common brain design and functional capacity, or blueprint, or general blueprint. And one species, which is shaded in the dark area, blue, purple dark, and this represents the species capacity. And if this blank area is a capacity of the macaques, then it's adapted in the middle to this environment. And if the environment or capacity shift a little bit, then through the learning, this identical genetically coded species can express or shift through the plasticity range to adapt to the new environment. That is a learning process. And this could be transmitted through epigenetic regulation of how control the development based on the existing blueprint design of the brain development pattern. So here, the epigenetic regulation or environmental structure, how we raise the kids, in which two embedded environment we raise the kids, that controls the expression patterns. And then, eventually, without learning, we automatically start expressing the new patterns. Like the human babies automatically start speaking. And that could be coded by environmental epigenetic factors, including the cultural condition. We can regard it as one of the epigenetic factors. And once this is crystallized, it is no longer beneficial to have this shifted middle average point. And mutation, or genetic mutation, can happen neutrally. This is a neutral evolution theory. But it could be selected by new shift of this average. And genetic changes can follow after this shift of the expression pattern. This is called Baldwin effect. Mr. Baldwin had proposed a few centuries ago, or called genetic assimilation. So in this way, we can speed up the evolutionary trait and direct one of the direction to be evolved. And this, again, resembles to the misinterpreted Lamarckian theory, but it's not actually is the misleading, I guess. And this is one of the hypotheses that we are now having. And another thing about the needed for this hypothesis that this plasticity or learning changes that I introduced you is forced by somebody else. It's not self-generated habit. In the macaque training, it took only 2 weeks. So it could be forced by somebody else. But for evolution to happen, there needs some internal motivation that individuals want to do that and mutually train it. And we need to have evidence that it could be recruiting in the internal self-motivational system. And here we utilize the marmoset, the small New World monkey. And they are a little bit unskillful compared to macaques, but could be trained to use tools. And for this tool-use training, it takes like a year. It's not like a few weeks of training. It's a very hard work. Experimenters keep them training through like 10 to a year or so. And during this period, we found the similar brain expansion pattern similar to macaques. But in addition to the macaque, the new discovery we found is just under submission, is that we found expansion of nucleus accumbens. The nucleus accumbens is known as a reward center. It produces the reward signal to the many brain areas to crystallize and strengthen that function. It's a reward center. It's called a reward center. And this is recruited during this long-term training period. So this will represent the sustained internal motivation mechanisms that's necessary for self-generated evolution to happen or driven. And through this evidence, combined with epigenetic trait, we might be able to formalize this hypothesis of epigenetic inheritance of the emergence of the new evolution patterns. And the question is how to prove it. We haven't proved it yet, but we just start proving. The most efficient way to do this is we have to find out it's actually naturally happened in the primate species. And that's not even enough. We have to compare the same species do the different things, depends on the environment, and the different species do the same thing, depending on the combination environment and condition. And the neurologists call this double dissociation design. And after this could have a more stronger proof of this hypothesis. And actually, looks like have the clue for doing this. I just, in the last five or 10 minutes, I will show you the evidence for that. The first thing is the same species do the different things. I told you that until recently, macaques are believed to never use tools. But recently, in Singapore is here, this is Malaysia, and this is Thailand. In the coast of the Thailand, and a group of people found there's a tool using macaque exists in isolated island. This is found after the investigation for the Aceh tsunami disaster in 2007 or something, a few years ago. And the investigator from the Thailand and also one from NTU have discovered this unique tool use macaques. And I actually went to this land last year and observed it. And here, maybe some of you know this species, but I just show you how they can use tools. Since they live in isolated island, we can shoot them shoot the picture on the boat. But so this is how they use tools. They use stones to scrape the oysters from the rock and crush it and eat it. And these are macaques, the same species is living in Singapore. And macaques never use tools, but since we don't know how long time of isolation, but they developed a culture that use tools. And if you analyze their behavior, they can use tools much more skillful than chimpanzees or apes. So this is not just a brain ability that allows the primate to use tools, but it's some combinations of the environmental structure and habitats and the requirement and how they allow to use tools. And we are interested about pedagogy, education, and how can I do this? And there's another example about a family coming to the coast to start using tools. There's many monkeys. almost all of them use tools. It's like a built-in environmental structure. The tool uses built-in. And there's a small babies here. And if you observe them, they are very unskillful. This baby is just mimicking the use tool, but they cannot use so much. And there's another one, this one, is just mimicking and clicking. It's very inefficient. But if you look at them, they are observing them, observing the parents and adults, and trying to learn it. And this has some mirror neural system must have been involved in these mechanisms. And why they can use tool here, this is still a question. And my colleague in NTU is now investigating this. But it seems like there's no predator in these islands. They're very safe and secured. And there's many stones and rocks around for the use of the tools. And there's many oysters. Accidentally, oysters are very high nutrition food and cannot be eaten without tools. And since this is a high nutrition, they can save time to eat food. They can spend shorter time with high nutrition. And they have a lot of time to think and full of materials around without the danger of the predator. And they emerge this intelligence. This is just a story to tell the hypothesis. And actually, the population density of this island is like 8 to 9 times higher than the other habitation. So they can subserve more numbers of monkeys than others because of this high nutrition, short foraging time, and so on, and more efficient way to forage as a result of the safe and long time for thinking. And this is one evidence. And this is the evidence that same species do the different things by the different environmental setups. And since we know the changes induced by artificial training, by direct comparison between these two groups of monkeys, we will find some evidence for that. And more interestingly, if we immigrate different culture of monkeys to the other groups, we haven't done it yet, we can observe how the culture transmits, how the education system can affect onto this culture transmission, and how this brain function subserve that. And this is kind of a dream that we are now scheming. And vice versa. Different animals do the same thing. Think about the New World monkey. Just I introduced the marmoset. And this lives in Brazil. And I went to that 2 years ago. And there is a phenomenon called niche segregation. They segregate in different niches and do slightly different things. And what is good about the marmoset is that they have some peculiar patterns of the behavior that resemble very much to the humans, like a vocal communication or social communication, pedagogy mechanism, foraging, and altruism. They feed others, give the food to other persons, other monkeys. And that's rarely observed in old world monkeys. And why is it? And also, since this is equator, the same climate as Singapore, it's easy to do that here as well. And what we did is, since these marmosets are very rich with vocal communication, resemble to human language, what we did is a whole genome sequence analysis comparison among different primate species, including humans, chimpanzees, gorilla, Neanderthals, and orangutan, the rhesus macaques, and marmoset, and compare the sequences of the so-called language genes. There's many language-related genes. We have already known more than 14 of them. And across species comparison, we found surprisingly that marmoset is most similar to humans, much closer than chimpanzees or apes. And why is it? Why the small so-called primitive primates have a common gene sequences as humans? And this is idea of the different species do the same things. And think about, so if you design properly, the marmoset is sometimes a better model for studying human intelligence. And think about evolutionary trait of the primate evolution. I'm sorry, but this is a Japanese expression, but this red one is prosimians, and this was our simians. And this is New World monkeys, apes, and Old World monkeys. Now, how the primate have evolved is New World monkeys and Old World monkeys have separated like 35 million years ago. And then New World monkeys have evolved by continental drift, remained in South America, New World, and stayed there. In the Old World monkey species, primate species, have moved to the Old World and now live in Asia and Africa. And what often misunderstood, even myself, I recognized recently, is that what have happened in the Old World is that first species have evolved in the Old World. That's the great apes. There's no Old World monkeys. There's many numbers of great apes in the Old World. And this is almost disappearing. There's only 4 species left: humans, chimpanzees, gorillas, and orangutans. So humans are endangered species. And we are almost disappearing. And after this, all the great apes have disappeared, then there's open niche, and then Old World monkey emerged. So the understanding is New World monkey is not the primitivist one, most primitive one, and then Old World monkeys evolved in apes and finally become human. This is the wrong story. The first Old World was occupied by great apes, and humans are remaining, meaning that the trait that humans have acquired is monopolized by humans. It's not beneficial for other species evolved afterwards in Old World monkeys to overlap with a human-specific trait. So this is a kind of niche segregation. When one trait is occupied one species, it's beneficial for other species to occupy other trait. So that's why Old World monkeys, including apes, are very different from humans. It is not possible, probably, to explore those traits in Old World non-human primate. But in the New World, since the human have invaded the New World, how many years? 1,000 years or 10,000 years? Very recently, they have in the New World they have evolved independently, regardless of the human existence, and they have their own niche segregation and segregated differently. And if one species acquired the same genetic trait as humans, they must have emerged to humans, become human species. But it didn't happen. So human-specific traits have been scattered in different species by niche segregation mechanisms. Now that's why, if it's designed properly, it is more efficient to find a human-specific trait fragmentally distributed in different species in the New World monkeys. So it is a theory of, it's a concept of the crown evolution and stem evolution. Stem evolution is something like separated very differently and isolated later. It's like driven by the continental drift, like what have happened 35 million years ago. And this could be explained by mutation and natural selection. But the idea is called crown evolution. In this sharing the common niche, this is evolved through the niche construction and niche segregation. And sometimes the species emerges and is more complex than just a simple evolutionary trees. So this niche segregation and niche construction happens through the interactions of environmental conditions and cognitive function, psychological function, and brain function subserving it. And this has some different mechanism for human intelligence to emerge. And we still don't know yet. But having this fundamental ground of ideas of emergence patterns of the human intelligence and biological mechanisms subserving it, I think we must be able to find out the concrete, hard science mechanisms to explain the soft science or psychological science or humanities and link them. And after knowing this biological concrete mechanisms, we can have the intervention to that. If something wrong is happening, we can intervene in it and how to adjust properly through the education system and cultural mixture system or handling it to avoid our crisis of the near future. So I think I'm running up of the time, and since this is a complex scheme, we have just concluded MOU between RIKEN, our institute, NTU, and Chulalongkorn University, where this Thailand strange monkey exists, and we are now scheming the complex research pattern to prove these crude ideas. And I would like to end up my talk with thanking to my colleagues. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Oh, that's the microphone here.
Yes, slightly running out of time, sorry.
That's all right. That's all right. This there's does it work? Does it work? It works. It works. There's time for questions to Atsushi. Yes, the one. Somebody brings a microphone to the gentleman.
Thank you. I have a couple of questions. One would be, how would you use your research findings to improve our human educational system? And
Research what system?
our own human educational system. I mean, what you have found by studying primates and how our minds have evolved. Maybe we're doing something terribly wrong with our kids.
I have many, imagination implications, but I do not have yet the firm, concrete proposal for that.
Okay. And another question. I mean, there are lots of very interesting examples of technology helping humans with severe cognitive limitations after injuries or some diseases to perform normal cognitive abilities. Let's say, as an example, Stephen Hawking being able to communicate. What would be the possibility of building such technological devices to allow other species who basically don't have, let's assume, the same functional abilities in their neocortex to perform at least some cognitive abilities with some sort of external technology?
Yeah, you said wisely, at least some.
Yep.
I think that is possible. So, but we are not sure if it's beneficial for that species to have human-like intelligence or bad habit or whatever. But we may be able to implement part of those ability. But they have their, human species have their own limitation by the evolutionary history. So that's why it might be not useful for them. But for experimentally, it is possible. And we may be able to find some beneficial principle out of that. And I think that should be the target of the research. But we never, I think, be able to, and we should not plan them to become humans.
No, of course.
I think that's not possible. And, well, that's it.
Yep, thank you.
Okay. You're second, but there's a lady here that had a question.
Thank you, and thank you for a very fascinating talk. Were we supposed to say who we are? I'm Michelle Merrill. I'm currently here at NTU. My background is actually in studying tool use in wild orangutans. And I noticed that where you're working is sort of, from a hierarchical standpoint, these lower levels, and where I was working was from organism up to social group and up to kind of social group interaction with ecosystem. And I'm wondering how much you've thought about trying to incorporate in your model these higher levels of kind of complexity and interaction, because there's a lot of feedback between the individual and the social system. You're seeing that a little bit in these small dyadic interactions that you had in the lab, but obviously in the wild their social interactions are much more complex.
Yeah, that's why I want to do. So through this immigration study, immigrate, bring in the few individuals from the tool use community to non-tool users, and how the culture transmit, and how that might have some intervention into brain function. And that's extend to further, more understanding and better control of that. And obviously, I think you touched on the higher level, that's meaning the social and the multi-individual interactions.
Yeah.
That, since I have only done about 2 monkeys so far, there must be more complex. It's not just complex is an easy term. It's more difficult and the more interesting mechanism by interactions with multiple individuals. And I definitely want to do that, but still have not started yet.
Right.
Roland.
Thank you. Roland Fletcher, archaeology from the University of Sydney. There's a piece of archaeological information which is rarely discussed from the Lower Paleolithic, which may be of great relevance to you. Once the Acheulean stone tools appear, and you get the Acheulean hand axe, as it's called, which has dual symmetry, a very strange phenomenon appears called macroliths. Macroliths are Acheulean hand axes which are too big to carry. And they're found lying around the landscape, and nobody can work out what they're for, except that you can really see them. What they indicate is that as the stone tools come into being, they create an environment of their own with which the brain is relating. And it may be that there is some kind of experimental work which could be done usefully by your team pursuing what would make that pattern. Because it relates to a larger phenomenon much further down time, which is that almost all stone tool work is a waste of time by humans. Peter White showed many years ago that a perfectly efficient stone tool is made by whacking one piece of rock with another and picking up the sharp bits. The elaboration of later stone tools is something in its own right, not necessarily a utility-related phenomenon. So there are a whole series of issues there about your training and learning becoming a self-referential phenomenon that may be of great consequence. Thank you for your talk.
Well, question about my Acheulean artifact is that it emerged like 150 million, 150 million years ago. And this stayed in the same shape for millions of years. And there's no evolution or development during that period. I think that is resemble to the beaver's niche construction. It's come to the useful hand axe pattern, and if it's useful and it's satisfied with that, it's never tried to improve it. However, I link that Acheulean with iconic representation. So meaning that regardless of the materials or size, they have a common shape. And probably that is represented in the brain in somehow strange, kind of icons. And I don't know about that huge, mega axe, but might be a sign or symbols of what is represented in the brain. Slightly start detaching from the actual usage. And so that's, in some sense, that's kind of the replica of the brain representation. I cannot go further than that, but must have a both way, starting from the stone tool patterns and also the mechanism subserving how to make it, and that would be the fruitful way of doing that.
There's a question on the right-hand side, front row, middle.
I have two questions. Janusz Hałys, University of Technology. First, can one observe changes in human brain due to digital revolution, due to the fact that we are using now different tools and different kinds of communication? And if so, how large are these changes?
Well, there's many reports claiming that changes, and that is not proved, I think not securely proved yet. But I think there's a sign of that, and there's a possibility to do that. But about the degree of the changes, I think that's smaller than what we have found in monkey training, because the monkey training is very artificial, and we can make the new function from null, from zero, and add up the completely new functions that the humans already know. That's why the change is massive. But the human technology, new technology, it's always a constantly a slight modification of the existing technology. So extension of the existing capacity. And that cannot be the huge changes. So probably I will guess that we cannot detect so large changes in humans as as we found in monkeys in short term or in our lifetime period. However, I will guess from your question is that it can narrow the direction of the evolution or the changes. So by accumulation of that over generation, probably the changes will become massive. And that will direct towards some direction, and that will really matter. It's probably one of those changes could be like a bifurcation point of the, chaotic evolution pattern. But I don't know. So they must be there. It's not proved yet. It could be very subtle. That's my immediate answer to that.
And the second question is about collective awareness, collective cognition, collective information processing. Do you think that one detect evidence that now in the world, the population is a total world population or some sub-communities, we form some new kind of species in the sense that we are neurons for a new animal that populate our Earth?
Well, I have a lot of imagination about that, but it's still remaining in the range of imagination, so we don't know. But I think there are always those kind of collective awareness implemented in biological organisms, like ants or bees or insects always have a collective kind of intelligence. And they have their own ways of interactions and communication and so on. And our new technology, internet technology, might serve as that. And we can learn from the insect studies, but I do not have direct link with primate brain, with the insect, it's micro mushroom brains. But there must be a common principle. I don't deny that, but I don't know yet.
Okay, there's many people that put up their fingers. I saw the sequence in which I saw them. I think you were the first, then you, and then Christian, and then four. We have about 10 more minutes to go on into questions, so go on.
Okay, I have two questions. The one, you talk about the different neurons, like mirror neurons, self neurons. So these neurons are basically different in terms of biological, physical, or they are the same neuron, just happen in different places in the network?
Well, I think nobody have stained the mirror neurons, so we don't know the shape of that. So in the biological information that those neurons possesses by themselves, that is not known. But what we know is that the neurons that exhibit in the mirror neuron, mirror neuron is not one single class of neuron. That's a concept that to explain the response pattern of the neurons. So there's no such a thing as the mirror neurons. However, the evidence here is that there's some, it's not myself, some other, my colleagues, have recorded the mirror neuron activities and measured which layer of the cerebral cortex they recorded from. And seems like they have recorded from different layers of the cerebral cortex, meaning that it's not necessarily the same kind, same cytoarchitectonic kind of the neurons that exhibit the mirror neuron activities. So probably, my guess is that those activities are expressed in the dynamics of the neural circuitry, subserving one particular function. And some of the neurons included in the circuitry exhibit a mirror neuron activity. And the researchers nowadays interpret it as a mirror neuron. They'll label those neurons as a mirror neuron, but I think it's not a single concept.
Okay. The second one, you talk about after the training or learning, you see lots of more connections, maybe from one region to another region. then maybe the new capability come out, something like that. So the question is that, is this new capability generated from this connection, or this capability is already built in, we just happen to connect them and recover it?
So capability, so that depends on how you mean or define the capability. And the new, say, more concretely, like an extension of the body image that I started with. All the animals have a plasticity or capability to adapt to the body growth. The body always becomes bigger, especially the primates are born small and become bigger in adult. They have to adjust their body schema to growing bodies. The constant extension of the body size. And there must be some safety margin or marginal range that allows those changes. And probably the tools accidentally fit into that range, like a sudden growth of the body. And that's why it starts to become able to use tools. And this capability is not defined by an operation of neural circuit itself. It's defined by interaction with the environment. It's like a Gibsonian affordance theory. The capability resides in the environment, how to interpret it. So the same function have a polysemous and different kind of meaning. And one didn't exist before the environment or such and such. And that's we consider as a new capability. And if it is useful, both the environment and the neural function expands in that way. And that I think is the kind of the selection of the capability across evolutionary processes.
Yeah, I think it's very, very important that you say suddenly. So something happens, it's not an increment, it's something changed suddenly. It's just like learning. I mean, something just happen. It's not an expansion, something, some jump there. So based on your framework, how we can understand this jump from 0 to 1?
So that's emergence. Isn't that emergence? It cannot predict from not existing. Well, I don't know. I don't have answer.
Let's get to the next question.
Thank you. Robert Marks, University of New South Wales. There were many things in your talk which were fascinating, but one question I had was, in the last 40 or 50 years, some researchers have been training chimpanzees to try to communicate with each other, or particularly with us, and given the problems of speech that they apparently have, they've been training them to use other sort of symbolic means of communication. My question is, has there been any investigation into neural changes associated with that sort of training in chimpanzees or other primates?
Well, from ethical reasons, the chimpanzees or ape cannot be subject to invasive experiment. So my short answer is I don't know, and I don't think they exist. But recently, there's some voxel-based digital morphology study of the chimpanzee brain. And they are, like from Emory University, they are claiming some differences in chimpanzees and different ability. But I don't think there's a longitudinal study during the course of the language or linguistic training of the chimpanzees. So I don't think so. And also, the chimpanzees are very powerful, muscular animals, and we cannot put them in the scanner. They will break the scanner. So there's no functional imaging studies on chimpanzees. So I don't think it's your question, evidence exists to subserve it.
Okay. David.
One thing is that there are some EEG, brainwave study about acquisition of those functions. And still the result remains ambiguous. But there are some efforts. EEG we can record non-invasively, so this could be done.
David Christian, Macquarie University in Sydney. That was a fabulous lecture, and I'm sure my brain is bigger than it was an hour ago, full of ideas. I have one simple question. Clearly, it's very important for you to be looking for environmental mechanisms, I think, that might have put increased pressure on social learning of some kind, if I understand you correctly. Is there any evidence that increased pressure for social learning may correlate in some way with group size? So I'm aware of some evidence that points in that direction, but I was wondering if this is relevant to your ideas.
I don't know. It's certainly interesting things, and I know that there are many scholars studying about social science and brain science and capacity, but still not in my scope yet. But need a large experimental setup, and it's something we have to do in the future.
Okay, then we have the question over there. And I think that would be the last question, then we'll have to ask Atsushi to be ready for answering questions while we drink coffee.
So considering the fact that natural processes are quite stochastic rather than being deterministic, so humans are the most intelligent species starting from almost equal platform with other species as well. So do you think that it is a mere coincidence or by random event by which we are the most intelligent species now? And if so, is there a wild possibility that maybe after a few million years, some other species become more developed than human being? So is there a paradigm shift is possible in development of human brain, or maybe some brain of other species as well?
Well, it's a different question to answer, but I think it's already the species more developed or intelligent than human already exist in their terms. Probably they're thinking that humans are stupid animals. But there's many ability that we are very much devoid of. So I don't regard human as the most developed species and their hierarchical structures. The existing taxa species are most developed in their own ways. And those, so I don't take those anthropocentric view, but more relativism, of the species relativism. And then that's why we have to think about the patterns of emergence across species and make it relativize among them. And then pick up and define the human-specific trait. And by trait, we can have a similarity in like a convergent evolution in other species. But if the human-specific trait were gathered in one species, then it's another human. And that's most unlikely to happen because it's not beneficial for one species to have the identical function in the same planet Earth. If there's another planet and they evolve differently, there might be the human-like. So the question, you're answering the question, if there are any species more intelligent than human existent a few millions later, there will be, and can be already here too.
One more query.
No.
Okay,
this was it. I think
do?
we have to stop this one and thank Atsushi again. But before I do this, now there's one emerging pattern that has come up in the last few years is a different way of showing our appreciation. And so if you're on Facebook, I'm not, but if you're on Facebook, you have something I like or I dislike. And this is our token of appreciation.
Oh, thank you very much. Thank you very much.